very excited to introduce Rick Harbison. He's the data guy with GPCOG. GPCOG just did a great regional housing summit, and people from towns all across the region came, and he has some interesting information that will paint where South Portland is in context of the region.
Thanks, Orion. I promise I won't talk for an hour about data. My name is Rick Harbison, planner at the Greater Portland Council of Governments. I thought I would just quickly cover the basics of who we are and what we do. Greater Portland Council of Governments, also known as GPCOG. If you have a suggestion for a shorter, catchier name, let us know. We were established in 1969. We offer a range of planning services and programs around the areas of economic development, sustainability, land use transportation planning, and expanding access to broadband across the region. We also try to be available to focus on kind of the pressing issues facing our region. So most recently, our focus has really been similar to the Chamber, the housing crisis, homelessness, and then also finding housing and supports for new Mainers. First, I just wanted to cover how did we get here. Housing crisis is, of course, a national crisis, but it does have regional nuances. So I thought I would talk about the extent of the issue in our region and what some of the contributing factors are. Most of the literature on the subject cites the Great Recession of 2008 as being kind of the root cause of where we are today. And that certainly tracks for our region. This slide here is showing census building permits for Cumberland County. And you can see it's 2003 all the way to 2023. And there's a great big dip, 2008 all the way to 2012. So that's the first part. Next is the pandemic. So we've had quite a bit of people moving to the area that just has happened to coincide with the pandemic. And so this is a graph showing population growth in Cumberland County from 2010 to 2023. And you can see there's a pretty significant uptick in population beginning around 2020. Why that is, it's, anecdotally it seems people are moving to Maine, kind of taking advantage of remote work flexibility that came from the pandemic. Other possible reasons, more people retiring to Maine, possibly moving to Maine for climate reasons. And then we've also had several influxes of new Mainers over the last few years. Whatever the reason, the bottom line is we've had an existing undersupply of homes and then this surge in population over the last few years, and that's really put a lot of demand on our housing. On top of that, we have rising interest rates that puts additional pressure on housing affordability. Imagine if you're a current homeowner and you have low interest rates, you were probably likely or reluctant to move and trade those lower interest rates for higher interest rates. And then if you're a new home buyer, you have the additional, there's a couple factors. One is that the cost of housing is already inflated, and then you have the additional high interest rate that you're paying. So it just makes it even further out of reach. There's a lot of other contributing factors. We probably could talk for an hour about this. Some of them that I just mentioned briefly, zoning and permitting can often promote single-family housing, can restrict mixed-use neighborhoods, can impose excessive parking requirements, add to project delays. Public opposition, there's been many examples in our region of large housing projects that have been voted down by residents. Seasonal and short-term rentals, this is an area I'd like to get a little bit more data on, at least with the short-term rentals, but seasonal homes certainly limit the supply for year-round residents. And our figure for Cumberland County is that 10% of homes are for seasonal, recreational, or occasional use. We also have a labor shortage, which is a little bit of a catch-22 because we need workers to build homes, but those workers also need homes to live. And then, of course, supply chain issues, which appear to be getting better, but they've certainly been an issue over the last few years. The result is that our housing costs have skyrocketed. I think this is probably the most impactful data point I can show. Essentially, what we're looking at is median home prices in orange and then median incomes in blue. So between 2013 and 2023, median home prices increased from $230,000 to $530,000. So that's an increase of $300,000. During that same period, median incomes increased from $58,500 to $88,500, so that's $30,000. So essentially, you can say that home prices increased 10 times as much as median incomes. So as you might expect, people are paying more for housing as a percent of their income. The census considers housing unaffordable if it takes up more than 30% of your income. And so if you use that standard, our current data shows that 22% of homeowners are cost burdened and 43% of renters are cost burdened. That's for Cumberland County. And it's 21% of homeowners are cost burdened for South Portland, 51% of renters are cost burdened in South Portland. Another impact is, that home ownership is not equitable in Cumberland County. It's a pretty startling statistic of 72% of white households own their homes and 28% of white households rent, whereas 17% of black households own homes and 83% rent. So the divide is pretty stark, and we have a long way to go there. So one of the big questions that we have to ask ourselves is how many homes do we need? And that's something that we've been working on, that the state has been working on. The state commissioned a housing production needs study that came out late last year. The state determined on the high end that we need 84,000 homes between 2021 and 2030 across the state of Maine. And then we would need 19,000 homes for Cumberland County, and that's the high range. Prior to that study, we created our own housing estimate based on our region. We came up with 24,000 units between 2020 and 2030. So accounting for the difference in geography between our greater Portland region and Cumberland County and the 1 year difference in the start year, I think our estimate is pretty similar to what the state came up with. So I thought I would first just show how we're doing against that 24,000 target and use that 24,000 target since that's the one that we're familiar with, that we're attempting to track. We are already 4 years in. So this is a graph that's showing building permits issued per year. And then the orange bars are that 4 year period between 2020 and 2023. We did substitute census data. So this is just a little bit of a note about the data. Building permit data you can get from the census. It's oftentimes estimated if the figures aren't provided, which is a voluntary thing for communities to do. So what we've done is we've asked every community for their building permit data. We have 30 communities. We've received data from about 12 of them. Where we have received data, we've plugged that in, substituted that in for the census data. So it's still an estimate, but it's just a slightly more accurate estimate than just the census data. At any rate, the dotted black line is our target of 2,400 units per year. The way we get to that is if our goal for the 10-year period is 24,000 units divided by 10, you get 2,400 per year. We had a pretty good year in 2022. We hit that 2,400 mark, but every year prior to that, we've struggled to get to that mark. And in 2023, we have a pretty significant decline in building permits issued, and that might have to do with the rising interest rates, could be related to pushback from the amount of development that's happened over the last few years. It's hard to say at this point. Another way to think about the data is looking at average permits per year. So in that 4 year period between 2020 and 2023, we averaged 2,000 units per year. So we now need to average 2,640 units per year over the next 6 years just to catch up and to reach our goal. Another note about the data is that this is likely a conservative estimate for a couple reasons. First is that building permits are just permits. They don't necessarily reflect construction. So there are a certain percentage of building permits may not end up in residential dwelling. Another factor here is that it doesn't account for housing loss. So we estimate that across the greater Portland region, we probably lose about 300 homes per year just through age and deterioration. And then it also doesn't cover conversion. So people may purchase a duplex and convert it to a single family home, and you would lose a unit there. I thought I would just show you, if you're curious, how South Portland compares to other communities in the region. So this is a graph showing the number of building permits issued between 2020 and 2023 for the communities that provided us data. And you can see South Portland kind of has a spot of its own. It's kind of in between Scarborough and Wyndham. Another way to look at the data is per capita. So looking at the number of permits issued per 1,000 residents. And when you look at it this way, the town of Bridgeton really stands out as a small community that's done quite a bit. And then South Portland compares similarly to Freeport, Wyndham, Westbrook, and Portland. Just showing this for informational purposes. It's not a competition. It's not meant to shame communities for not doing enough. It's just something that we get a lot of people are curious about, how much housing is being built in their community and how does that compare with what's being built in other places. So I thought I'd close out with some challenges. Housing is a really complex, the housing crisis is a really complex problem, and there's just many, many factors. We could have a whole lecture series about all the factors that go into the housing crisis. It's also a dynamic problem, which is particularly challenging when you have a target of 24,000 units by 2030. Like, that could change next year. By 2030, we could have 24,000 units and it's still not enough. So that's a challenging piece of it. Every community is different. So from a regional, for our perspective, looking at the region, we have 30 communities. They all have different needs, different staff capacities, different political dynamics. That can be challenging. These are my own personal gripes now. There's a data lag, so we look at census data a lot, and that's often a few years behind. The most recent data, census data, is 2018 to 2022, a 5-year period. And so like 2018, just with the pandemic, just feels like a lifetime ago. And then lastly is logistical hurdles of just gathering building permit data to really track what's being built. It's challenging for 30 communities every year. Different communities have different staff capacities, like I said. So just getting that data and tallying it up and cleaning it up can be challenging. Okay, so I just had one more. I just wanted to put a plug in for this new website that we launched called greatmainneighborhoods.org. It's a website and kind of an initiative that we're working on. There's 3 sections on the website. The first is Get Inspired, and that features success stories from around the region. There's a compilation of news stories. There's videos. Essentially, it's examples of what's working right now in southern Maine. We have a Get Informed section, which is a housing data dashboard that I've been working on. A lot of the data in there is stuff that I showed you tonight. And then there's a Get Started section, which is a housing toolkit that has policy recommendations, suggestions that communities can employ. And then last, I just wanted to mention that we had a similar event. Well, we called it a housing summit at Ocean Gateway in Portland just a few weeks ago. It was a really great event. The materials from that event and the videos of all the panel discussions, presentations are going to be posted, if they are not already, on that Great Maine Neighborhoods website.
One of the things that was said at the GPCOG Summit, Christina Egan said, was, if we freeze things the way it is now, your community is going to change. By not changing your community, you're changing. When you saw that chart from Rick, if we didn't build any housing, the cost of housing is just going to go up. Mm-hmm. And this idea, and you hear this all the time, of people say, I want my kid to move back here, right? So the housing you're building is not for this mythical person from away. Your housing is to keep South Portland, because you look at that $58,000 income guy, that $88,000 income girl now, they can't do housing. That's who South Portland was. And if we don't build housing for them, and housing of all kinds, those people aren't going to live here. The people who historically, that working class roots that is South Portland, it's not going to be that way if we don't approach these challenges holistically and do what we're doing tonight and do what the city council is doing.